From doing it by hand to doing it by machine, they revolutionized the world of work. From passive viewing to active gaming, it transformed how we play. And from looking up at the moon to walking on it, changed our view of the universe. These were all inventions of the 1960s, a decade of protest, free love, and Cold War rivalry that turned science fiction into science fact. Robots, the taser, and the spaceship that took us to the moon, they were inventions that shook the world. Terrible weather conditions can arrive at a moment's notice. So being prepared and knowing what's coming can save your life. Satellites have removed the guesswork, and it is all because of a scientist who made it his objective to launch the world's first meteorological eye in the sky. In 1944, Dr. Harry Wexler was about to prove he was no ordinary meteorologist. As a hurricane approached the east coast of the US, Wexler prepared to observe it by flying right into the eye of the storm.
Sir? Are you ready for your flight? I'll be right there.
It was the first time a scientist had attempted this type of first-hand research.
But he was a pioneer, and he was willing to take a chance. Well, I think he was truly curious, and he thought that the plane could go out and bring back useful information.
Back in the 1940s, hurricanes were a complete mystery.
There were no eyes in the sky. There was no way to tell what was out there except scattered ship reports, and that was not even in real time, so it was guesswork.
Harry Wexler was a curious and brilliant scientist, educated at Harvard and MIT. Mathematics was his speciality, but it was weather that was his passion.
Harry Wexler never turned down a challenge. Harry was a gregarious, very outgoing kind of fellow, extremely smart, very bright, and was interested in just about everything that had to do with meteorology.
Wexler and his pilot flew into the hurricane in a US Air Force bomber, battling winds of up to 200 kilometers per hour. On reaching the eye of the storm, the plane was suddenly sucked upward by strong vertical wind currents. Until this moment, scientists had assumed hurricanes only had horizontal currents. It was a major advancement in hurricane research, but the new information was not helpful. The hurricane sank 5 ships, killing 344 sailors. Dozens more people died when it made landfall. To save lives, a hurricane warning system had to be created. This meant a way to track the hurricane long before it reached land needed to be developed. The inspiration Wexler required came from an unexpected source. The British science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, who had been following Wexler's research.
One day in the early 1950s, Harry Wexler opened his mail and had a letter from Arthur C. Clarke asking him his ideas about a meteorological satellite.
It was an idea ahead of its time, as satellites were still at a concept stage. Both the Soviet Union and the US were racing to launch the first into orbit. Wexler was intrigued.
That led Wexler to think about all the things you might be able to see from outer space, looking down on the atmosphere. Clarke really did lead Harry Wexler into a train of thought which was very fruitful and helped develop some of the early technologies for weather satellites.
Wexler imagined a satellite that would orbit above the Earth, taking pictures of weather patterns while they were forming. He saw the satellite orbiting around the North and South poles, crossing the same lines of latitude at the same time every day. Each time it passed a particular point, it would take photographs and transmit them back to Earth. It would take a huge amount of resources to make. He took his idea to everyone he knew in government. For years, nothing happened. Then, in October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Wexler's idea was given the go-ahead, and NASA began to build his weather satellite, Tyros-1. Wexler's idea was given the go-ahead, and NASA began to build his weather satellite, Tyros-1.
Harry was right there, able to shape the early developments.
Wexler's idea required two cameras. One that was wide-angle to photograph 2,000 square kilometers at a time. The other, a high-resolution for close-ups. On the 1st of April 1960, at Cape Canaveral, Florida, Wexler's satellite was ready for launch.
The dramatic moment of launching. All goes perfectly.
Tyros went into orbit 800 kilometers above the Earth. It circled the planet once every 99 minutes. Wexler waited anxiously for the first set of images. If the pictures were not clear enough to show weather patterns, the mission would be a failure. However, the results were even better than Wexler had hoped.
The first pictures from Tyros, they clearly showed ice in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They showed cloud formations that could be matched to the storm theories of the time. This is actually a holy grail of meteorology.
But it was not until September 1961 that Tyros faced its first test. Hurricane Carla was headed towards the Texas Gulf Coast.
Carla was the largest storm ever that landed on the U.S. soil. It's larger than Katrina.
Tyros photographed Carla as it formed in the Gulf of Mexico, allowing meteorologists to track her. It gave authorities time to evacuate more than 500,000 people. Harry Wexler's vision was saving lives.
Harry's contemporaries called the weather satellite Harry's dream. Harry Wexler's contribution really marked a turning point in our quest to get a complete view of the Earth's weather, a view that can be shared internationally, that can cover the oceans and the southern hemisphere and remote areas. And so it really is the fulfillment of an ancient quest of the meteorologist.
Enabling them to predict and prepare for whatever was approaching. Other inventions of the 1960s. 1968, the waterbed made waves in bedrooms across the continent.
This is the latest American sensation in indoor living.
Marketed as a pleasure pit for free love and aspiring ladies' men. 1961, the amphicar rode the waves, but the concept sank without trace as it didn't float anyone's boat. 1963, the lava lamp cast a groovy glow, thanks to a British inventor's brew of water, wax, and carbon tetrachloride. They work around the clock, are never ill, and do not complain. Yet these robots do most of the repetitive work, all because an inventor thought humans shouldn't have to. George Duval's favorite place was his garage in Connecticut, where ideas percolated and inventions were born.
George Duval was a serial inventor. He was a guy who chose not to go to college because he was so brilliant that he was capable of making a living just by coming up with inventions on his own.
By the mid-1950s, George had helped invent all sorts of devices, such as the phantom doorman that used a photoelectric cell to open doors.
George Duval was kind of a nerdy guy who was really focused on the details. You know, he wasn't thinking about the big picture. He was really focused on how his inventions actually worked. And not so much on whether people would want to use them or what the applications were or anything like that, which is why he wasn't the greatest businessman.
While looking through a technical journal, he saw an assembly line, an image of monotony that set his imagination working. George wondered, why should human beings have to do such mind-numbing work?
You're doing that job again and again and again. And once you do it all day, human beings just lose concentration. And losing concentration meant that you could get injured, and people did.
George thought that if something else were to do all the repetitive work, the workers' lives would be improved. If that tool were to move similar to the human arm, grab onto things and lift them up, its possible uses would be mind-boggling.
It had to be able to pick up heavy parts. It had to be dexterous, so it had to be able to get a hold of those parts and hang on to them and move them to another place and let go of them.
George pictured a machine that had a wrist that could bend and rotate similar to a real hand, with two opposing fingers to do the grasping. The arm's actions would be controlled by a computer, which could be reprogrammed for different jobs. George obtained a patent, but he was unable to find anyone to listen to his idea.
He's really focused on details, he's really technically proficient, but he's not really very good at explaining what he's doing to anyone else.
His break came by chance at a friend's party.
George. George Duval, I'd like you to meet Joe Engelberger. I have a feeling you boys have a lot to talk about.
George, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Joe.
I think we need a drink. Can we get a couple more?
Joe Engelberger was an engineer with a background in physics, who was also a very sharp businessman.
So, George, what line of work are you in?
Well, see, I have this idea.
The two get to talking, and Joe suddenly realizes that what George is describing is something that he's read about in science fiction, only it's real, a robot.
Very interesting.
Joe spotted the huge business potential and all the possible uses for a robotic arm. It was the beginning of a fruitful relationship.
Come on in, Joe. This is it. I know it doesn't look like much, but we can clean all this stuff out of here.
George concentrated on building a working prototype and solving engineering problems that arose. Joe began to identify all the potential uses and buyers for a robotic arm.
He was going to factories and he was trying to figure out the lowest hanging fruit. Where can robots help first? So he was trying to identify really important jobs for robots. And that means jobs that people don't want to do.
One of their biggest engineering challenges was how to adjust the robot's grip so it was adaptable for different tasks. The solution was to install pressure sensors inside the machine's hand. The heavier the pressure, the stronger the grip was needed to be. The robot's movements were programmed into a computer.
You just move it through the motions, and then it would record that, and then it would play it back again and again and again, all night long, never going to sleep, never asking for a break.
The prototype was called the Unimate. The duo continued to refine and test it, proving that their invention was adaptable to a multitude of tasks. It seemed as if success was inevitable. But George and Joe had not counted on the image that robots had in the US.
At the time, robots were just like witches or werewolves. They were completely made up. It was just like any other boogeyman that was used to scare people in a story. When robots appeared in popular culture, they were typically killing everybody. So this is a tremendously difficult business problem.
The US's lack of enthusiasm was disappointing. George and Joe had to expand their horizons. And in Japan, the post-war economy was booming.
In Japan, robots were much better perceived. And so there was no drawback for the Japanese companies to tell everybody, hey, we've got robots.
Japanese car manufacturers began to use Unimates, and productivity boomed. The rest of the world took note, and the robot revolution began.
This was a real turning point for humankind, because one minute we were just using tools, and the next minute we were letting our tools do their jobs on their own, completely autonomously.
In 2003, the Unimate was inducted into the Robot Hall of Fame. But it was George and Joe who deserved the real credit for working out that almost anything can be made with a robot. Also invented in the 1960s. 1962, the touch-tone phone was quicker than the rotary phone.
I beat you.
1963, the rocket belt hoisted military pilots into the air on a blast of steam. But they ran out of fuel in 21 seconds, so the concept never stayed aloft. 1964, AstroTurf.
A significant improvement on nature.
Plastic grass that turned a mud bath into a field of green. Passive viewing to active gaming was an unimaginable leap in the early days of television. Interacting with a TV was a stuff of science fiction until a brilliant man invented the game box. By the 1960s, Ralph Baer had already made his mark as an electronics genius. As a teenager, he escaped Nazi Germany to the US, where his scientific intellect flourished after the war.
Ralph Baer is one of the finest examples I can think of inventive ingenuity. Ralph was the kind of person who was constantly thinking, 5 to 7 steps ahead of everybody else in society.
During the late 1940s and 1950s, Ralph created everything from hi-fi accessories to snooping devices that observed the Soviet Union. He was also convinced television could be less passive and more interactive. It was a radical concept in the 1950s, so no one listened.
At this point in time, it was absolutely insane to try to think of reacting to a television set in any way other than just viewing, in any way other than just being spoon-fed by whatever the networks or the small independent companies thought they could feed you. Basically, it was a medium where you just took it in. You had no say in what you saw, except for changing channels. And in those days, you didn't have that many channels to change.
In 1966, Ralph was designing equipment for a military contractor. He was working with an alignment generator that created test lines on a TV screen.
You had these testers that would put crosshatches of horizontal lines and vertical lines on the screen so that you could test them and make sure they were working.
The machine inspired him to imagine a completely new type of game.
He realized this would be really fun if we could put it in the user's hands and the user could play with it. What if I could bounce those lines around? What if I could chase a dot around on the screen?
To turn his idea into reality, he needed to find a way to generate a signal that changed those static lines into symbols that moved around the screen. It was in September 1966, while sitting at a bus stop, that it started to fall into place.
Ralph pulls out his spiral-bound notebook. He starts making notes. He creates this memo. In the first page, he visualizes, a whole gamut of game types that could be useful in video games.
Ralph realized that if a radio frequency or RF signal could display moving pictures on a TV screen, it should also be able to generate game symbols.
You getting on, buddy?
Ralph knew it would be difficult to persuade people at the office about his new idea, where the focus was on serious military technology. So he started to develop his TV game in secret.
At this point in time, Ralph has enough people reporting to him and enough budget to be able to disguise what he's doing.
Ralph set to work using the components of an alignment generator. He used a radio frequency oscillator to generate a video signal. Then a component called a sync generator synchronized that signal into one that the television understood. A modulator then sent the signal to the TV and placed it on channel 3 or 4. As the signal entered the TV, a spot appeared on the screen, which could move horizontally, vertically, and change shape. He had proven that his concept worked. Ralph then built an actual game box. But it wasn't user-friendly. He had used glass vacuum tubes to regulate the flow of electricity, and these took up too much space and blew.
You couldn't put out a consumer game unit that was based on vacuum tubes because, they would blow out and you would have to replace the tubes.
However, new technology enabled Ralph to progress. He enlisted a talented colleague, Bill Harrison, who knew all about transistors. Tiny silicone semiconductors that performed the same function as vacuum tubes, but without the bulk or fragility. They also meant Ralph's game box could be smaller and more user-friendly. Finally, a prototype game box was completed. Each game came with a plastic overlay, such as a ping pong table, to make the game more realistic.
This way, gentlemen.
In June 1967, Ralph and his colleague decided to unveil their secret project to the bosses.
He was tired of hiding all of the expenses in the budget, and he hoped that maybe he could loosen some of the purse strings.
Ralph had no idea how they would react to a game that was built without their knowledge. At first, the executives didn't know what to make of Ralph's game, but once they got the hang of it, they were hooked.
Imagine, if you will, two men with military experience, all the maturity that you expect to see, but here they are playing on a television screen with all the intensity as though their life's prestige depends upon it. That's the way it was in that 10 by 20 room.
Ralph's bosses gave him over $2,000 for staff and $500 for parts, so Ralph could develop the game box further.
Imagine that. The video game revolution began on $2,500 worth of R&D money.
Ralph's TV game box became the Magnavox Odyssey, the world's first home video game console.
Magnavox presents Odyssey, the electronic game of the future.
It arrived in the shops in 1972, and over the next decade, Ralph's idea transformed the home entertainment business.
I don't think he would have dreamed that he was creating an industry that would be in the billions of dollars by this time today.
In 2006, Ralph received the prestigious National Medal of Technology in honor of his video game inventions from the US president. Police officers can now apprehend a difficult suspect by subduing them with a zap. A grown-up invention that had its start in a childhood fantasy. In the 1920s, a young Jack Cover could not get enough of his favorite book.
Okay, Mom.
It was called Tom Swift and His Electric Rifle, and was about a boy who could neutralize criminals without killing them. Jack grew up, got a PhD in nuclear physics, but then changed course and was drawn to the new world of aerospace technology.
He just was really effusive with both energy and intellect. He's one of these people who just had to be on the move, was always looking for new intellectual challenges and new adventures in life.
By the late 1960s, Jack was a chief scientist involved in the US's race to land on the moon. But it was the national news that sparked his imagination.
Can you believe what's going on in Chicago?
Race riots and anti-war protests were affecting many parts of the US.
In the 1960s, this country was torn apart over the Vietnam War. There were protests that were turning violent across this country. And at the same time, we had the rise of hijackings and terrorism. So it was a violent and unpredictable world that was emerging in the 1960s.
And it must be met by the...
President Johnson wanted the development of a non-lethal weapon to subdue protesters without killing them. While reading the paper, Jack noticed a strange, unrelated story.
He reads an article about a man who's walking through the woods who goes to climb over a fence, and apparently that fence had been hit by a power line, and just enough electricity was flowing through the fence and through this man that he couldn't let go.
The man was temporarily incapacitated, but not injured.
And I believe that was the eureka moment where Jack said, well, the country needs a safer way to subdue people so you don't have to kill them. Electricity can immobilize, and yet people can recover fully. Why don't we take electricity, combine it back with my boyhood memories of Tom Swift and his electric rifle? He had the vision of how to solve a major problem.
Jack found the most up-to-date science on electricity in the body, and then began to build a prototype with bits and pieces from his garage.
Jack would take ordinary parts, sometimes as simple as a tongue depressor or a rubber band, and do extraordinary things with them. Bicycle tire valves and some plastic tubing and some other parts, and next thing you know, he's got an advanced ballistic cartridge system for firing electrified electrodes.
Jack hoped that by firing at a living target, he could temporarily halt that body's own electrical signals.
Inside my body, as I'm sitting here right now, there are trillions of electrical impulses moving through the nerve fibers back and forth between my brain and every sensor in my skin. They control all of my muscular movements, my sight, my smell. Every sensation in the human body are electric signals that are being transmitted around within the body.
His device used electricity stored in a battery. Gunpowder charges fired two insulated wires with darts on the end. When both darts hit the target, the electrical circuit was completed, delivering a shock that temporarily disabled the body.
I can shut you down like a Star Trek phaser. I can stop your brain from being able to control your body so that you can't attack me, you can't harm me. But like a light switch, when I turn it off, you return right back to normal.
Jack calculated the combination of voltage and current required for any given target. Enough to ensure the muscles contracted, but not enough to damage the body.
So once they've built the first tasers, they've done the engineering calculations, of course, they need to then begin testing them, and that would include some animal tests.
One of Jack's first test subjects was a buffalo from a local animal park.
Jack was able to take a buffalo, put it safely on the ground, and yet allow it to get right back up, back to normal immediately.
there was only one way to take testing to the next stage.
There's nothing that speaks to the safety of a product like an inventor who's willing to use it himself.
So Jack willingly volunteered to take the next hit, with a little help from his sons. So far, so good.
When his sons saw that example, they too stepped up. They were part of this taser mission as well, and they also volunteered to take hits.
These were only the first tests of hundreds, but Jack Cover knew he had invented a super effective non-lethal weapon. He named his invention after the childhood fantasy that started it all. He used the book's title to create an acronym, taser. It took another 2 decades and lots of modifications before police forces began using the device in the US.
Jack was excited to see it finally take off. It had been a long, hard road for him. And to see law enforcement adopting the taser en masse around the world was a nice capstone for his life.
Today, the taser is used in 44 countries by police and military personnel. Thanks to a maverick scientist who wasn't afraid to take the first hit. Also invented in the 1960s. 1969. The ground proximity warning system alerted pilots so they could ascend quickly to avoid a crash.
But it's far superior to what we had before, which was nothing.
1968. The jacuzzi turned the pool into a bubbling social event. Some believe it makes werewolves howl or crazy people prowl. Myths about the moon have enthralled for decades, but no lunar legend compared to the true story of a small spaceship that went there for real.
$551 million, fiscal 62.
On the 25th of May, 1961, space engineer Tom Kelly and his wife were among tens of millions of Americans glued to their TV sets.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
President Kennedy's speech was a rallying cry. The US's rival at the time, the Soviet Union, had been achieving victory after victory during the Cold War space race.
The Soviets had demonstrated over and over again from the late 1950s all the way to 1961 that they could do pretty much whatever they wanted, or so it seemed, in space. They'd been the first to launch a satellite. They'd been the first to send a robotic probe to the moon. They'd been the first to photograph the back side of the moon. They were the first in 1961 to send a human into orbit. All of those firsts suggest that they were perhaps the world leader.
We nevertheless are required to make new efforts on our own. For while we cannot guarantee...
The US desperately wanted a first. Music to Tom Kelly's ears and to his bosses at Grumman Aerospace, a company that built jet fighters. NASA wanted to land on the moon, and Tom's company wanted to take part. But they had to convince NASA that they had the most achievable idea. Should they fly the astronauts directly to the moon, or launch them from a mothership? Tom Kelly's team preferred a third concept. A command module would orbit the moon, not the Earth. One astronaut would wait in orbit, while 2 others would descend to the moon in a separate vehicle. Then they would rendezvous back with a command module.
Lunar Orbit Rendezvous was very controversial at the time. There were a lot of people who didn't think it would work. They thought it was far too risky, and that their chances of stranding somebody on the lunar surface was too great, and didn't want to go that route.
Tom helped to convince people that it was the only way to succeed, and his company won the contract to build the vehicle that would actually land on the moon. Tom was put in charge of the project. He knew the lunar vehicle would not look like the jet fighters his company usually built. The new invention only needed to fly in low gravity, and what was required was a vehicle influenced by science fiction. But how to build a machine in a laboratory that would never actually work in the Earth's atmosphere? And how to design landing gear, not knowing the type of surface the vehicle would land on? The design mutated into an insect-type structure with long legs.
The legs of the lunar module have to do 2 important things. The first thing they have to do is they have to absorb the shock of the landing. They're also long and gangly. In case there is some dust that you might sink into, you would still be above that with the major part of the spacecraft.
Another challenge was how to maneuver the lunar module once it had left the command module. A propulsion system on the bottom of the descent stage of the vehicle would help it to land on the moon. A second propulsion system would separate the top of the vehicle, or the ascent stage, so it would be able to lift off from the lunar surface.
Now we have to build it.
Construction of the lunar lander began in January 1963. One of the biggest challenges was to keep weight to an absolute minimum.
Anything that flies, weight is the primary consideration. And with the lunar module, it's especially the case because it had to go to the lunar surface and then back up, and you only had a certain amount of throw weight with the rocket to be able to do those things.
Tom Kelly's team stripped the lunar lander to its bare essentials. They even redesigned the interior, so there was no need for seats.
The seats in the lunar module first were tossed because of the weight. There's just no question about that. They were also big and bulky. They didn't see any reason that they had to have them. The astronauts were not going to be in there that long. They were just going to essentially ride it down to the lunar surface so they could stand while they're doing that.
They replaced large windows with a small one.
The glass is very heavy, and over time, they realized that they didn't need to have that much picture window space.
Tests also proved that the vehicle could land safely on just 4 legs instead of 5.
When you're doing major engineering problems, it's all about finding solutions to problems. It's a real delicate task, and Kelly was a master at it.
By 1967, the lunar module had taken shape. Astronauts were busy training how to use it and the command module. Then, on the 27th of January 1967, disaster.
What?
A command module simulator caught fire during training. 3 astronauts were killed.
It was a devastating setback. For the first time in the program, astronauts in the line of duty in a spacecraft were killed.
The tragedy shocked the entire US space program. The future of the moon mission was in serious doubt. NASA spent months rethinking. For Tom Kelly and the team building the lunar module, it was a reminder that if scientists neglected even one small detail, the astronauts may never return. Training intensified. Astronauts were put through their paces in 0 gravity.
The astronauts had to learn to fly the lunar module on Earth, but they would never fly it in a gravity environment or with an atmosphere in real life. So they had to build vehicles that simulated what the lunar module was going to be like when it flew in space.
So they built this machine to simulate what it was like to fly the lunar module. Training was hazardous as some vehicles crashed. Sometimes astronauts had to escape using their parachute. But by 1969, they had successfully finished their Earth-based training. The lunar lander was then tested in space. It was launched into Earth's orbit, so scientists could do a final check on everything from engines to docking mechanisms. Then it was full steam ahead for the ultimate test. On the 16th of July, 1969, the Saturn V rocket was waiting on the launch pad. Tom Kelly and his team were among the thousands of scientists, engineers, and technicians whose futures depended on what happened next. The biggest rocket at the time blasted the lunar lander and the command module toward the moon. A few hundred kilometers above the Earth, the command module separated from the rocket. It turned 180 degrees and withdrew the lunar lander out of the rocket storage bay. When the vehicles entered the moon's orbit, the lunar lander detached and began its rapid descent to the surface of the moon.
Go for landing. 60 seconds. Lights on. Forward. Forward. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
As Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin took the first steps on the moon, Tom Kelly was with them for every step.
It's fascinating what the lunar module was able to accomplish as it took us to another world. It shaped our understanding of the cosmos, our understanding of the solar system. The lunar module shaped the world by helping us change our perspective on the universe.
And it spurred us on to contemplate even greater challenging journeys, further out into the universe.